And don't forget, the moon is travelling round at about, I think, 6,000 miles an hour, isn't it, Jim? Jim is having those. At 50, so that was the point. You see, they hoped to land on the edge on the edge of the mountains, a very hazardous landing place, so you had to time your launch so that you took off in daylight, you arrived there in daylight, you arrived, you met the moon as it came whizzing round, and at the right time for the astronauts to land in that position. So that's why it was so important to land at 13 hours. Well, we were so having established all that, we still haven't taken off yet, but at last the day came for launch, and something went wrong here too. For the first and only time during the Apollo program, one of the engines, the center stage engine in the middle of the second stage there, shut down 2 minutes early. That doesn't sound much, but when you remember that you've got 8 minutes to go from a standing start to reach a speed of 17,000 miles an hour to get in Earth orbit, 2 minutes can be forever. But although they only had very primitive computers compared with what we have now, their computers responded thousands of times faster than the human brain could, and kept the other engines burning for so many seconds longer to make up for the loss of that second stage engine, so that it still reached, Apollo still reached Earth orbit. And they then went round the Earth 3 times at 17,000 miles an hour, while mission control worked out that there was still plenty of fuel left to go to the moon. 3 orbits later, they refired the engines, and to raise the speed from 17,000 miles an hour to 24,000 miles an hour, which is the speed you need to break free of Earth's gravity and go to the moon. And we'd all settled down. Margaret and I then had to make a 1,000-mile journey from mission control at Cape Canaveral, then we rushed from there to Houston, Mission Control Center at Houston, because the launch is controlled from the Cape, the mission itself is controlled from Houston, 1,000 miles away. And when we got there, everything was quiet and peaceful. We went and had dinner at our favorite cafe at Houston, where the famous Red Adair, the man who always wore this huge Texan hat and was a wonderful man who used to go and put out fires on the oil rigs. He was the only man in the world who was brave enough and skilled enough to go out and put fires out when they broke out on the oil rigs. Anyway, as we came back from dinner, what I always did was to look into mission control to make sure everything was going smoothly. Margaret and I looked in, everybody else had gone to bed. It was 10 o'clock Houston time, 4 a.m. in London, 6 hours time difference. What I used to do was look in there, make sure it was all right, then I'd record a 1-minute progress report to be broadcast on the BBC news bulletins 7 and 8 a.m. Then I'd go to bed for 6 hours and wake up in time to cover for the 1 o'clock news. And they were having they were having quite a pleasant television throw from Apollo 13, and Hayes was demonstrating how difficult it was to get into a hammock which he'd rigged up so he could be more comfortable. And Lovell was saying that's all he's really interested in, sleeping and eating and so on. And so everybody was cheerful and jolly, and they said, it's time you shut down and had a night's rest. So they said, okay, good night. We were turning to leave and go to bed, and at the door, when Mission Control said, oh, hang on a minute, there's one more thing you've got to do before you go to bed. You've got to stir up the cryo tanks, the cryogenic tanks. And this is what caused the explosion. And we were almost out of the door when we heard Hayes and then Lovell say, we've got a problem. Houston, we've got a problem, the famous words. And although they were quite calm when they said it, I had a feeling that this was it. And in fact, one of their oxygen tanks had exploded when they tried to stir up the cryogenic tanks. And there they were, at that moment, they were 240,000 miles from Earth, and they were falling towards the moon at 2,200 miles an hour. No way of turning back. You've got to go on. So for the next hour, we listened to Mission Control and the astronauts, very much awake instead of going to bed, saying, what are we going to do, you see, and beginning to plan. It was breakfast time in London, and the panic in London was far worse than in Mission Control, I can tell you. That's Margaret and I sitting at our desk at Mission Control. It was, don't forget, it's 1970, 40 years ago. I was the only BBC man there covering for the whole of BBC. I had 2 lines hooked up to my tape recorder, one for transmission and one for reception. That's how I did my broadcast. And as breakfast time approached in London, every programme in the BBC, every news and current affairs programme started ringing up and saying, what's this great crisis? What are you going to do for us? And Margaret intercepted the call and said, Reg is much too busy talking to you. Tell me what you want for your programme, the 7 a.m. news or the television news, or whatever programme it was. It might be BBC 2 or BBC 1. And I will log your requirements, and for heaven's sake get on the line, because he can't do any broadcasting at all until you get off the line. So for the next 3 days, that's what we were doing. In London, they sent for all sorts of instant experts, Patrick Moore and James Burke and other people, to come and sit in the studio and explain to the public what was happening. And our ordinary audience of was 2 or 3 million pounds, 2 or 3 million people.